Hello and welcome, dear participants. This is Regina Mathias, Associate Professor in Electronics, St. Joseph's College, Autonomous, Bangalore. On behalf of the management, the principal, Reverend Father Dr. Victor Lobo, staff and students, I extend to you a very warm welcome to this webinar. Human brains are special. Are they really? It gives me great pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Suhas Vijayakumar of Harvard University, United States of America. We have 1,538 registered participants. Among them, 27 are foreign nationals. I thank each one of you for this astounding response. Welcome once again and thank you.
Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for finding time and visiting us on this webinar today. I am Aishwarya and allow me on the behalf of the Department of Electronics to welcome you all to today's session. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Suhas Vijayakumar, Postdoctoral Fellow, Neuroscience Lab, Harvard University. Sir, your journey is really inspiring and we are very glad to have you here with us. Okay, so without much further ado, we'll move on to the talk. Over to you, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here at my institute where I started my academic journey. Let me not take any more of your time and go ahead and start the presentation. Right. When I made the title for this particular talk, I had no idea what kind of response we would get or who would be actually in the audience. So I went ahead and kind of named it slightly mischievously as Human Brains Are Special. Are they really? And then I realized that I had to kind of divide this talk into two parts because last time I checked with about 1,400 participants, there are school children from 4th grade until 12th grade, school teachers, university students, professors, accountants, industrialists, speech language pathologists, priests, lawyers, medical doctors, mental health counselors, environmentalists, artists, and the list goes on. So I ended up dividing the talk into two segments. In the first part, we are going to talk mainly about uniqueness of humans and test whether this uniqueness is real or not. And then we move on to discussing what exactly is special about the human brains. In the second part of the talk, we will actually look at some of the peculiar things that the human brain does. So in the first part, mostly we'll be talking about neuroscience as comparative neuroscience, where we try to compare brains of animals and human beings. In the second part, we focus on some of these peculiarities that the human brain has. So in part one, humans are special. If you have ever thought about who we share this planet with, you would obviously have seen this kind of a tree diagram before, wherein we have tons and tons of living beings on this planet. Interestingly, we are a tiny, tiny part in this mammoth of life tree. You must know this person, Charles Darwin. And in The Descent of Man, Darwin placed all of the animals in this kind of tree structure. And conveniently, he placed humans on the top. And this has been kind of drilled into our heads that humans are somehow special. But what exactly makes us special? And when we ask this question, turns out I usually get answers like empathy, culture, intelligence. We solve problems. We use tools, we make tools. Morality, we have a sense of what is fair and what's not, what's right and what's not. Language, we have the ability to speak. We have plenty of social rituals and so much more. But I want you to stop and think, are they really specifically uniquely human? I'm here to argue they're not. So let's get started with the first one that I mentioned, empathy. So empathy, you might know, is the ability to relate to other people. If someone else is under stress, you know that they're under stress, you want to empathize with them, you want to comfort them. Did you know that rats actually do have empathy? In fact, they can even forego eating chocolate in order to save a fellow rat from drowning. How did they really test it? Well, they basically had 3 areas. In one of them, there was water. It's called the pool area here. And there was ground area and there was food area. In the food area, experimenters put in some chocolates that these rats really, really liked. And there was 1 rat in the ground area, 1 rat in the pool area. Now, rats really don't like to swim. They absolutely hate water. So when you put 1 rat in water and the other rat is safely on the ground, it could actually open this sliding door so that the rat that is in water could safely get on the ground area. And they would not be able to do this if they did not have empathy. I have a video clip from the study here. As you can see on the left, there is water, and the experimenter is placing a rat in water. They don't like it. They're already looking for a way out. Now the experimenter is placing another rat on the ground area. And this rat conveniently ends up letting the other rat in so that it can get to safety. Fantastic. And it's not unique to rats either. Elephants can sense when other elephants are under stress, and they have this behavior that they do. They go and wrap their trunk around the other animal to comfort them. Chimpanzees also show empathy. So empathy is clearly not uniquely human. What about intelligence? Story time. I'm sure all of you must have heard of the thirsty crow story in your primary school or so. You remember there was a thirsty crow that wanted to drink some water, but it couldn't reach the water in the jug. So it went around, looked for some stones, it put it in the jar until the water level raised, and then it happily drank the water and flew away. And the moral of the story, as we are told plenty of times, is that where there is a will, there is a way. But this is quite an intelligent behavior for an animal. Can they actually do it, or is this just a story? Well, it turns out scientists actually get paid to test these things. So here is a crow. As you can see, in one of the beakers, there's water. In the other, there is sand. So if it puts stone in the sand beaker, nothing will happen. Whereas if it puts stone in the water beaker, ideally, food should surface. And that's exactly what it's doing. It puts 1 stone, it's not enough, it still can't reach it. Oh, now it did. So essentially, it was able to solve this problem by trial and error. In fact, they can do this with different types of weights. They usually pick the heavier weights first, and they can even do it with different types of objects. essentially they can solve problems. So crows are quite intelligent. So again, intelligence is not uniquely human. Then we come to tool use. We humans can make tools, and then we can use tools. Again, we go back to the crows. Here you can see that the crow is using a stick as some kind of a fork so that it could get food out of this box. In fact, if you look at chimpanzees, as Jane Goodall, one of famous primatologists, have repeatedly studied, chimpanzees use tools day in and day out. Here you can see a chimp actually cracking a nut using a stick. And adult chimpanzees, usually the mothers, teach baby chimpanzees how to use these tools pretty much as they are growing up. It's fantastic, really. So again, tool use, not uniquely human. What about a sense of morality? Like what's fair and what's not? What you'll see in this video is there are two capuchin monkeys in these cages. What they're supposed to do is they have to take a stone from the experimenter. They have to give it back in order to get some kind of a reward. Let's see what happens. So the first monkey gives the experimenter a stone. It gets cucumber as its reward. The second monkey gives the experimenter the stone, but the second one gets a grape. Interestingly, capuchin monkeys really, really like grapes. So now the second time, when the first monkey sees that it's been given a cucumber again, it is absolutely enraged. It doesn't feel like it's getting enough reward for the same amount of work that it's doing. And it continues to display anger. It, in fact, even tests whether the stone is real or not, if there's any kind of difference before actually throwing cucumber back at the experimenter, which is amazing. Like, they do have some sense of morality. There is further research going on this topic, so we'll find out more about how exactly they do it, or are there some other confounding explanations. So again, morality, not uniquely human. What about social rituals? Magpies are these birds that you might have seen around. What they do is when one of their fellow magpies passes away, they stand around, they make a lot of noise, but they make sure that the body of the dead magpie does not come to harm. They sometimes even bring some grass pieces and then they leave it there as some sense of respect towards the passed away magpie, and so on. So social rituals, again, not uniquely human. We'll come back to the other ones, but essentially, to quickly recap, we used to think that humans are unique, but a lot of these seemingly unique human traits can be seen in other animals too. But we separated from our ancestors along with chimpanzees some 5 to 7 million years ago. And since then, both chimpanzees and humans have been evolving simultaneously. But as humans, we were able to first invent airplane and then go on to invent human space mission in a span of 58 years. That's kind of insane. That kind of quick growth is absolutely amazing and is not seen in other animal species. So maybe we are looking in the wrong place. Maybe we shouldn't be looking at what we are doing, but actually ask, where exactly is this behavior coming from? Which brings us to the brains. Again, we used to think human brains are really, really special. I really like this quote by V.S. Ramachandran, in which he explains how amazing the brain is. He says, here is this 3-pound mass of jelly that you can hold in the palm of your hand, and it can contemplate the vastness of interstellar space. It can contemplate the meaning of infinity, and it can contemplate itself contemplating on the meaning of infinity. If you look at brains of different animals, in this particular chart, you will see how big they are, how heavy they are, and also how many number of neurons approximately each of these brains have. And if you quickly glance through these brains, you notice a few things. Some of the obvious ones are that human brains look really big and that they look more folded than other species. So are they really special? Well, is human brain the largest brain around? Well, turns out not really. In fact, blue whale brain is much, much bigger than a human brain. In fact, about 5 times larger than a human brain. So it's not really the largest. But what about within humans, within our own species? Again, not really. In fact, if you look at all of the previous Homo family of species, turns out we did have a rapid growth in the size of the brain, but then our brain, as we have it now, the average brain size is actually less than what Neanderthals had, for example. So our brains are actually smaller than our immediate ancestors. But what about all of those folds that we were talking about? So we had people studying brains from like centuries. These are maps that a scientist named Brodmann made, in which he tried to identify different regions of the brain in human, macaque monkey, lemurs, and hedgehogs. But here is the problem. Brains can and they do change in all kinds of ways. Let's take an ancestor brain. Through the course of evolution, this ancestor brain can actually develop a new region altogether. For example, in this image, you can see this green region. That's actually a new region that has appeared through evolution. And it has kind of pushed aside the previously present region. Or a previously existing region could actually change how it functions. Or there might be new connections between regions. Or the strength between the strength of the connection between regions might also change, or the balance of these connections can also change. So broadly speaking, there can be changes in its physical structure, or there can be changes in its connections. Let's take a step back. Let's imagine that you wanted to compare maps of Mysore and Bangalore. One way to do it is you could just take Mysore's map and then enlarge it and fit it to Bangalore's map in order to compare them. In this way, you get some sense of how have different areas in Mysore, how would they increase if they were to be size of Bangalore and so on. In fact, we can do the same thing with brains as well. You can take a macaque monkey brain and then expand certain regions in order to make it look like a human brain. And turns out there are only certain regions that need to go drastic expansion and not all of the regions in the brain. The regions that you see in red here have to be expanded a lot, whereas regions that you see in blue don't really need to be expanded. Okay, something interesting is going on. What about changes in connections? We use something called connectivity fingerprint matching. Let me go back to the example that we were using. Again, considering 2 maps, Mysore and Bangalore. And let's say you want to ask the question, is there a palace in Bangalore? Now, let's say the only information that you have is how do buses travel in Mysore and Bangalore? You know where the main bus stand is in Mysore, you know where the main bus stand is in Bangalore. And the information that you have in Mysore is that buses travel from the main bus stand to the Mysore Palace at certain times, at certain frequencies, at certain speed, whatever. You just have some information about the traffic between those two places. You can take all of that information and apply the same thing in an unknown scenario in case of Bangalore and figure out where exactly Bangalore Palace is, which is kind of amazing. And that's what we do. We take a region in a brain that we know, and we want to find a similar region in the other brain that has similar connections to the rest of the brain. We want to compare and find this particular region. How can we do it? Well, we just study the connectivity pattern of other brain regions, and then we find one that closely matches the one that we know. So what can we do with such a method? Well, you can ask, humans have a pretty decent language. Is there a language region in monkeys? Well, it turns out using this method, my PhD supervisor and his other students, they showed that in fact, macaque brain does have a region that resembles the language region in humans. That's amazing. But is there any region in the monkey brain that's not found in the humans? Turns out there is. It's in the front of your brain, in the middle. It's called the lateral frontal pole, and we think that it's involved in doing abstractions, trying to figure out rules for whatever situation you're trying to solve. You can actually take all of the connectivity information between brains and do the same thing as we did last time. You could take a macaque monkey brain and then try to predict how would a human brain look like based on its connections, and then compare it with an actual human brain. And then turns out all of the red regions in this image is where we cannot really predict what is happening. And these regions are actually responsible for things like maintaining a large social group, trying to empathize with others, trying to understand what is going on in someone else's mind, and so on. So, another recap. We used to think that humans are unique, but a lot of our behavior we were able to find in other animals. And we looked for uniqueness in human brains, but the story is basically complicated because, you know, brains have changed in all kinds of ways, and doing this kind of research is really hard. But we are getting somewhere, as you've seen some examples just now. But just because we were asking brains are special, we don't need to stop there. In fact, special or not, brains are awesome. And that's what I'm going to convince you in the second part of the talk. Hope you're still with me. Let's start with a phenomena called synesthesia. Now, what is synesthesia? Well, in a person who has synesthesia happens to have some kind of interaction between all of their senses. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you consider one example of synesthesia, grapheme color synesthesia, what usually happens is every letter of alphabet is associated with a color. Like A can be green, B can be red, and so on. So every time this person sees this A, B, and whatever letters, they have a very specific color also associated with it. Here is an example of number color synesthesia. As this person has kindly drawn for us, each of these letters clearly represent a single number, except for 3 and 9, and that kind of depends on like the surrounding numbers or so. So if you're thinking, well, what does that even mean? Hold on. Here is a simple test. Okay, I want you to do this with me. I'm going to show you an example of the kind of tests that people use to find if someone has synesthesia or not. So in the image that I'm going to show you, you're going to see 5s and 2s. But just the twos make a specific pattern. I want you to tell each other or put it in the chat box, what pattern do you see? Okay. You basically have, let's say 10 seconds. All right, good luck. Right, that was the time. Did you get it? Well, if you did not get it, it means that you don't have synesthesia, because if you did, for this specific form of synesthesia, you would have seen something like this. So the twos actually make a triangle. So essentially, I do see that in some in live chat, some people are telling us that it forms a triangle, which is amazing. In case you didn't know already, write this down. It's called synesthesia, where different senses are talking to each other. Well, what is the explanation? To be entirely honest, we have no idea. The best understanding that we have is that the wiring in the brain it usually starts out as being hugely connected. So all areas are connected to all other areas when you're born as a baby. Whereas as you grow older, the connections that your brain does not need get kind of chopped away. Maybe in synesthetes, this kind of chopping away does not happen. And that's why different senses continue to interact. That's kind of amazing. Moving on, I want to talk to you about attention blindness. It's sometimes also called selective attention. And here is another task for you, okay? The test is, you will see a video in just a few seconds. I want you to count how many passes of basketball do the players in white make. So there are two groups. One group is wearing white clothes. I want you to count only the number of passes that the people wearing white make. Are you ready? Well, how many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15. I'm sorry if in the live stream the video is a bit patchy, but the correct answer is 15. But the more important question is, did you see the gorilla? If you're wondering what I'm talking about, I'm going to play the exact same video one more time. Let's see if you can see the gorilla this time. Rewinding a bit, and we start again. This time, I'm sure you did not miss it. Well, again, the explanation. The thing is, your attention is kind of a limited ability, and you need to specifically direct your attention to a certain thing, and your brain kind of focuses extremely highly on that particular thing and basically does not look at anything else. You can you can look this video up on YouTube. If you look for selective attention, you'll find this video. Show it to your friends. Ask them if they can notice the gorilla or not. Now, the third thing I want to tell you about is that brains can change all the time. You might have this notion that we are born with a brain and we basically grow old. And as we grow old, some of the neurons die and that's it. But actually, it's quite different than what you might think. So each of the brain regions is usually thought to have a specific function. It's divided into frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and whatnot. And each of these lobes and areas are assigned specific functions. And this is the kind of image that you might have seen in textbooks or wherever. If you start reading anything about the brain, this is something that you immediately study. Let's take the example of this visual area, okay? It's called the occipital cortex or the visual cortex or visual area, whatever you want to call it. Now, as you might have guessed, visual area is responsible for processing visual information. So whatever you see through your eyes goes through the optic nerve and then reaches this visual area and it gets processed inside this visual area, right? This is what is supposed to happen. Now imagine someone is born with blindness. In order to move around, some of them use this technique called echolocation. What they essentially do is they make clicks from their mouth, like, and whatever is echoed back from their surroundings, they are able to process it and navigate through the world. Again, if you look up echolocation and blindness, you will find plenty of videos on YouTube that shows how some of the blind people do it. Now, what some researchers did is they asked them to come into the lab, lie down in an MRI scanner. This is what an MRI scanner looks like. And what it can do is it can measure where exactly in your brain is the processing happening based on where the blood flow is increasing or decreasing. Now, they called in these blind individuals. Remember, so they have no visual input coming into their eyes. Even if it's coming in, maybe there's optic nerve damage, it does not reach the brain. So what was supposed to have been originally the visual area would now start to process sound. So it becomes part of auditory area. So what you see here is where there is increased activity when they hear back this echolocation sound. So clearly brain is not fixed. They were born with what would have been traditionally visual area, but clearly that has now become auditory area, which is fantastic. I'll give you another example. If some of you play any kind of string instrument, violin, guitar, cello, whatever, through practice, what actually happens is in your brain, there are regions that control your finger movements. Because you use these finger movements so often and for such complicated movements, that area actually grows bigger. So the people who practice music for a long time, their brain area that controls their fingers actually physically grows. Another example, in this case, researchers asked some participants to come into the lab and then they asked them to start juggling. They started with just 2 balls and then they went up to 3, I think. What happens then is they observed changes in not just like brain areas that process information, but also the wiring in the brain, the white matter connections that connect different brain regions. They saw changes in those white matter regions. So it's not just the brain region that's growing, even the connections, the wiring between regions, that also changes. with practice. And of course, they also saw changes in gray matter, which is essentially like the processing unit of the brain. Again, amazing. So brains are not fixed. They keep changing. They change all the time. But they do need quite a bit of practice. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is called Anton Babinski syndrome, sometimes just called Anton syndrome. This is particularly interesting because when someone has this Anton Babinski syndrome, what happens is, for some reason, their visual area that we were just discussing about, that is at the back of your brain, has some kind of damage, be it from stroke or from some kind of accident, whatever, and they have gone blind. So now they're blind because of damage to their visual cortex or visual area. But they deny it. They will not accept that they are blind. If an experimenter asks them, well, can you see? They say, yes, of course I can see. What are you talking about? If the experimenter says, well, here is a paragraph of written text. Could you please read this passage for me if you say you're not blind? They usually just make up some kind of excuse and they say, and they cannot read it because obviously they're blind. And if the experimenter says, well, am I wearing a white coat? Am I wearing a tie? What do you think? The patient usually says, yes, of course you're wearing a white coat. And the tie really suits you. Like they're not just saying, yes, you're wearing a tie. They are trying to convince themselves by giving even more information to the context. And they say, the tie really suits you or something. So essentially, they entirely deny it. No matter what you say, they completely deny it. Even if you provide them with ample amount of evidence, they deny it. There's another condition called anosognosia, where someone who has a stroke, let's say due to stroke, they cannot move their right hand. But if the experimenter asks them, could you wave with your left hand, which is fine, they wave with their left hand. And then they say, could you wave with your right hand? They say, yes, of course, and I am waving, even though they can see that their hand has not moved from where they had previously kept. Explanation, honestly, we have no idea. We have just started to understand how these brain disorders happen, and a lot of theories hint towards these wiring connections being damaged. So yes, the visual cortex in this case has been damaged, but the brain region that kind of has some kind of self-awareness about that there is no information coming from visual cortex. That's the best theory we have. So to quickly recap, we used to think humans are unique, but we can find a lot of unique human traits in other animals. We looked for uniqueness in the story is quite complicated there because brains have changed in a lot of ways. But brains are fascinating anyway. And we saw some examples of it. You know, the senses get mixed up and we still don't know why exactly this happens. It's called synesthesia. And our best bet is that the wiring in the brain, it has somehow miscommunicating. Then we saw that attention is kind of limited, and wherever you direct your attention, that gets amplified, whereas it ignores pretty much everything else. Brains are not really fixed at birth. In fact, they're quite plastic. This changing of brain is called brain plasticity, and it basically happens throughout one's life. And we don't really understand plenty of disorders yet. But we started with this question in the beginning. Human brains are special, but are they really? If you put a gun to my head and asked me to answer this question, I would say, well, they're not really special, but there are definitely some changes when you compare it with other animals. But I think we usually tend to make mistakes when comparing with other animals because we tend to look at everything from a human perspective. The thing is, I really, really like this cartoon. In this, there's a test, and the examiner is saying the test is that the exam is that everybody has to climb that tree. And you can see that there is a seal and there's a fish, a penguin, an elephant. Obviously, they're not well versed in climbing the tree, just the monkey is. And the monkey will obviously get the passing grades, and the rest of them will probably fail. But the point I'm trying to make is brains have evolved over the years for its owner to deal with their environment. So a monkey's brain is really, really good at hanging upside down from a tree. A fish brain is really, really good at dealing with how do you swim through the water, how do you quickly change direction in case you sense some shark coming your way or something, and so on. A human brain, as far as we know, is special in a few ways. One would be that we learn really, really quickly. So if you give humans new problems, they end up learning fairly quickly, whereas other animals need plenty of training. And humans also have really large social groups. You might have plenty of friends on your Facebook page or whatever, but the current best estimate is that an individual can have 150 friends that they can keep track of and really be close to. So we are really good at solving problems, complicated problems, and learn quickly. We are really good at maintaining social relationships, and we can use language at like sophisticated levels that other animals usually don't. If you're wondering, can animals really talk? Again, YouTube parrots and Alexa or something, or parrots that talk, you will clearly see that parrots can basically talk pretty much quite clearly. You can understand it quite clearly. So yeah, other animals have the ability to speak, but they don't use language the way we do. We write poems, we write essays, and write film scripts and whatever. So human brains are not really special, but certainly different from other animals, but we don't really need to judge them because all animals evolve their brains for very specific purposes. And we know quite a lot about brains now, but there is so much more to learn. And I hope this has motivated you to go out there and learn some more about the brain of both human brains as well as other animal brains. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for these really amazing facts. Okay, so this is to inform all the participants that a feedback form would be available after this webinar is over. So you have to fill it to get your e-certificates. So please don't forget or skip the feedback form, as it's a necessary step towards getting your e-certificate. And now we'll have the Q&A session. So you can post your questions in this chat, or we'll also be receiving questions from YouTube, and you can shoot your questions. Sir, actually, we have already received some questions.
Okay.
You ready?
Sure. Let me drink some water first.
Yes, sir. Okay,
Please
sir.
go ahead.
So the first question is from Lata Srinivasan. Can neuroplasticity be increased after 50 years?
That's an interesting question. I'm afraid to say we don't have a very specific understanding of this, because a lot of times when we conduct research, we take students as our participants who end up being undergrads or master level students. But what we do know is after 50 years, if you don't have any pre-existing conditions like mild cognitive impairment or somewhere along the lines of like Alzheimer's disease or something, or Parkinson's and so on, it should be able to change just as any other brain would. I would bet my money on saying yes, it's possible to change the brain even after 50 years.
Okay, sir. And we have one question in the chat. Sir, can you tell something about delusional disorder?
Okay. Again, so like the Anton Babinski disorder that we just mentioned is an example of delusional disorder in which the reality is something else, whereas the person who has the disorder believes a completely different reality. There are plenty of other examples as well. I mentioned anosognosia. Sometimes you might even have just like distancing oneself from reality, not being able to process what really is happening in the world, and so on. Our best bet, again, is that the connection between different processing centers of the brain and the one that's kind of holding on to this reality is somehow severed, and that's probably causing delusion. Sometimes there's also this thing called cognitive dissonance, which happens to all of us. As an example, let's say if you have an iPhone, you have paid a lot of money for the iPhone, so you cannot dislike it. You absolutely convince yourself that you really, really enjoy using iPhone, even though you don't, because that's just beneficial to feel good about yourself. So we fool ourselves in all kinds of ways, and to be honest, we don't know a lot of answers in that area. But quite a lot of research is going on. I mentioned V.S. Ramachandran's quote during the talk. He is one of the leading people who is studying such disorders. In fact, his work on phantom limb syndrome is phenomenal. What happens in phantom limb is, let's say in an accident, a person loses one of their limbs. Let's say their right hand is severed, but after the operation, now that they don't have the right hand, they still have some kind of twitching in the hand as if the hand existed there. And yeah, V.S. Ramachandran has used mirrors to try and relieve pain of these individuals. There is a TED talk by V.S. Ramachandran on YouTube. It's called 3 Clues to Understanding Your Brain. Highly, highly recommend it. If you are more of a reading person, there is a book called Telltale Brain or Phantoms in the Brain. Pick either of them up. You'll know so much more about delusion disorder than I do.
Okay, sir. So there's one question that even I wish to ask. Does genetics play a major role in the capacity of a brain?
Again, great question. So this has been the debate in basically every single subfield of neuroscience. Is it nature or nurture that makes a human being? Like, if we are born with certain set of genetics, can we change that and be better? Essentially, that's the question. And the convincing answer that research has time and again shown is that it's both. Yes, your genetics play a role, but the kind of environment you grow up in, the kind of social support that you have, the way you manage your stress and deal with your mental health issues has a much, much larger role to play in how you function as a human being. Specifically in case of intelligence, again, genetics has some role, but if you get the right kind of education, if you are interested in the field, doesn't matter what your intelligence is, you'll be perfectly fine.
Okay, sir. So we have one question. How does prolonged depression change the brain?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the word before depression.
Prolonged depression.
Prolonged depression, right. So there are different reasons why someone might be depressed, and the one that we can extensively study is about how an imbalance in neurotransmitters can cause depression. So what is happening essentially is, think of your brain as an engine. Okay, you need for an engine to function properly, you need both, like petrol or whatever fuel you're using. It needs oil to keep it lubricated. It needs to be free of dust, no friction, whatever. It needs to be in a good condition. So there are plenty of factors that go into the engine that makes it a good engine. Similarly, in the brain, there are plenty of neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and so on. They all have to be in a certain level of balance for you to have a good level of motivation, to be full of life, as they call it. When there's an imbalance in these neurotransmitters, someone might go to depression. To treat that, we have tablets that are called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. What they basically do is they fix this imbalance in the brain, and you immediately see the changes that you would likely want to see. So prolonged depression changes the brain in the same way that an engine starts to malfunction. Like, you don't have enough motivation, so you're not doing enough, you're not getting enough stimulation, etc. So fixing it using SSRIs or other tablets, or cognitive behavioral therapy, if the cause of depression is something else, helps to restore that balance. I hope that answers the question, whoever asked it.
Yes.
Aishwarya, are there any questions from the YouTube?
Yes, ma'am. There's one question, which is a personal question. How did you get into neuroscience?
Okay, so as ma'am mentioned in the beginning, I studied physics, electronics, and math during my bachelor's at St. Joseph's College. Towards the end of my bachelor's degree, we were taught concepts like theory of relativity, introduction to quantum mechanics, and so on. But I always wanted to be a physicist. And as soon as these concepts were introduced, I felt like I was somehow like losing touch with reality. And I wanted to do something that was more related to our day-to-day lives. And then I started reading a bunch of books, and V.S. Ramachandran, whom I've already referred to plenty of times in this talk, I watched his TED Talk on YouTube, and I was hooked. So then I tried out neuroscience for a year, being a research assistant at National Brain Research Center in Gurgaon. And yeah, have been in neuroscience ever since.
Okay, sir. So we have one question. Does tension reduce memory power?
Brilliant question. Short answer is yes, absolutely. The long answer is, in fact, memory interacts with a lot of different things, specifically emotion and sleep. These are the two key things that you need to have really good memory. Now, let's take each of them and then look at what exactly they're doing. The first one I mentioned was emotion. Now, let's say you are extremely excited to go to a fantasy park. Let's take Wonderla, for example, which is near Bangalore. And you go with your friends, you have a really good time, you're really excited. All of those memories get stored in your brain quite easily because your brain interprets that as important information. So positive emotions, memory storage is easy. The same thing happens in a negative situation as well. Let's say you're under a lot of stress, or you've just heard some really bad news. Anything that happens in that immediate time, around that immediate time, your brain considers that as more important. Evolutionarily speaking, if you were living in a forest, for example, let's say you're walking somewhere and then you hear a voice of a tiger, for example. That's obviously stressful because you will be dead if you don't run. And the exact space where you heard that tiger or lion, whatever, gets basically imprinted in your brain. Your brain immediately stores it as really important information so that you don't die. Because that's how we learned, evolutionarily speaking. Anything that was stressful was really, really important because that meant we could live longer. So if you're stressed, if you're under a lot of tension, it impacts your memory. But again, like there is a weird balance in this. If you're extremely stressed, this happens. But then there is also like a certain level of stress that's just not helpful, because then your brain goes into, instead of let me fight this, let me push through mode, it goes into fright mode where it's just planning to run away from the situation. So it just doesn't learn anything new. So just the right amount of tension is what you need to be able to remember better. Now, the second thing that I said was sleep. We have learned that when you're asleep, your memory gets consolidated, which means your brain goes through whatever has happened in the day. It decides which of those informations are important and then stores them while you're asleep and basically unconscious. So tension, sleep have a very direct link with memory. I hope that answers it. Aishwarya, your microphone is muted.
Sorry. Okay, so we have a question from Dr. Satish. We started learning through images, photos, pictures, along with language. How does the brain distinguish?
Right. So there are different areas in the brain that process different types of information. So, for example, if you see the letter A, there are some regions in the brain that only look at the lines in that letter A. They just process that information. That's all they do. When it comes to the meaning of letter A, there is a different set of regions that interpret the meaning of letter A. If you're talking about a particular sentence, again, the same thing. As a sentence, it might mean completely different than what the individual words mean, for example, in idioms and phrases. So that's again handled by a certain other brain region. So usually there are certain regions in the brain that take care of different aspects of language, as well as understanding meaning in paintings, for example. In paintings and stuff, you would have more regions involved because you're trying to interpret what the painter would have wanted to say. So it's kind of indirect interpretation. So I would argue that your brain is working extra hard to decode that information. But I don't want to give you the wrong idea that there's only just one center in the brain that does this job. It's a lot of regions, they're all interconnected, and they all have to talk to each other. Sometimes what happens is someone suffers from stroke to one of these language regions. Then what happens is they lose the ability to speak. So if they say something, they don't, it's usually gibberish. They lose the ability to make sense of words. So they just say random things. That's one type of aphasia. There's another type in which they can read the words, they can say it, but then they don't know what they mean. So this usually happens when those brain regions are damaged because of stroke or accident or whatever. Now, what happens is a person can recover from this because if, let's say, generally the left side of the brain is, let's say, processing all of this information, now the right half of the brain takes over from the left side of the regions that have been damaged, and then it starts processing meaning and words and so on. So like I said, brains change all the time, which means that they can also cope with accidents like this. So yeah, I hope that was the answer they were looking for.
So there's a question: do other animals also have imagination, or is it only us?
Such a fantastic question. I love this question. The thing is, it's really, really hard to know because we cannot directly test this, right? For humans, we know what imagination means. You can just ask someone, can you imagine something? But obviously we can't do that for animals. But if I had to guess, I would say, okay, no, it's really hard. I honestly don't know. I can tell you what I was thinking of when I said if I had to guess. I was thinking about dogs. If any of you have dogs as pets, you might know that they actually dream, and they might be running in their dream. They move their like paws and stuff when they're asleep. So something is happening in the brain. Like they are dreaming, which is a weird form of imagination, if you ask me. So I was going to say yes, but it's not like a real form of imagination. If you press me hard on that, I honestly have to admit we don't know. In fact, even in humans, we honestly have no idea how exactly this works. A friend of mine is now studying this, and they have shown when you see something, what happens is information enters through your eyes, and then it goes to that visual area we were talking about at the back of your brain. And then that information is again sent to the front of the brain, where all of the meaning and context and what are we going to do with this information is all calculated. Now, when you ask someone to imagine something, it actually happens the other way around. The regions in the front of the brain, they start to activate earlier, and then it goes to the visual area, and then you can say, oh, I'm imagining X, Y, or Z, or whatever. So we are beginning to understand what happens in the brain when we imagine things. But yeah, there's not a lot of literature on that as well. And certainly not anything on other animals being able to imagine. Interestingly, there is a condition in humans. I'm forgetting its name. No. Anyway, so essentially what happens in that condition is that people cannot imagine things. So if I asked you to imagine going to the front of your house, opening the door, walking through the hallway, reaching the room or something, you can imagine this in your mind, right? You can almost see walking through the house. But these people say that they cannot do it. So yeah, we don't know what's happening there as well. We don't know if they really cannot imagine or if they think that they cannot imagine. Again, still an open question, plenty of research to be done.
So there's one question that's coming in a lot of times. What do you think of the Sapir-Whorf theory? It's a theory which states that we think according to the language we speak. So what do you think of this theory?
Yeah, so there is a lot of evidence to show that the way we perceive the world, the way we experience the world is heavily influenced by our language. The one study that comes to mind is, I forget if it was Russian researchers who did this, but whatever. So they studied two groups of people. One of them, in their language, they had more names for different colors of blue, different shades of blue. Whereas in the other language, there was basically like dark blue, light blue, and whatever, like blue, green or something. So in the first group of people who had more um, shades of blue, who had names for more shades of blue, they were also able to see subtle differences in shades of blue. Whereas the group that did not have names for different shades of blue, they would say the two shades of blue were the same. They couldn't even distinguish it, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. And the only difference was that one group had different names in their language, whereas the other one did not. So yeah, that's kind of interesting.
So there's one question, which is, it's like, which is better, day study or night study?
Brilliant question. There is really no evidence. I'll tell you what we do know. When you're a baby, you essentially spend most of your day sleeping. And that is even necessary because you're processing all this information from the world, you're trying to deal with whatever your problems are when you're a baby, and then you're sleeping a lot because you have to basically grow. As you get older, you start sleeping less and less. And there are these different cycles in your body called circadian rhythms that keep track of when you should go to bed and when you should wake up. Okay, so as you reach the teenage years, let's say when you're entering high school or so, turns out that your sleep cycle is actually delayed. So naturally, you go to bed later, and then you wake up much later than 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, whatever, later than 9 o'clock. So now there are studies that actually show that when schools shifted their time and started their high school classes after 11 o'clock in the morning, those schools also had students doing better at tests in school. So when you try and change the environment in which someone is learning according to their sleep cycle, they naturally do better. This we know for sure. This has been proven time and again at multiple schools, etc., etc. So, and we also know that from sleep research, some people are just really good at working in the morning, and some people are really good at working at night. This also we know. Some factors in your genetics determine this. But the percentage of people who are really, really night owls is fairly low, something like 10% in the general population, I think. So to answer that specific question, there is no fixed thing for everyone. Please keep track of when you naturally go to bed, when you're naturally waking up. The most important thing is you should wake up refreshed. If you're not feeling refreshed, sleep for longer and get enough sleep so that you're well rested when you wake up. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you sleep, your sleep actually happens in different sleep cycles. And these cycles actually last 1.5 hours on average. Again, some people might have slightly shorter, some people slightly larger. So the important thing to keep in mind is you have to wake up after your cycles are complete. So if you end up waking up, let's say after 2 hours of sleep, it's very likely that you'll wake up annoyed and groggy and you won't be able to function as well as if you had waken up after 3 hours, which would have allowed you to complete 2 sleep cycles. So take sleep cycles into account, your natural circadian rhythm into account. Wake up feeling well rested. It really does not matter when you study.
Sir, I hope I'm not overexerting you with all these questions.
No, not at all. I mean, we still have time.
Yes. So there's one question. can we say that human brains are special because we believe in stories and fiction?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, couple of theories that hint at this. One of them is that humans became special because our brains got bigger, and with that we had bigger social circles. And the main way we started bonding with people was through two things: food and stories. And even today, I mean, if you want to make new friends, it's better to go for food, and then any conversation that happens around food is generally nice. So food. Sorry, and the second one was stories. People would sit around campfires, tell stories, and it allowed them to empathize with other people better. That's basically the point of stories, right? It shows you the world from someone else's perspective. So in that sense, it did make us special. But if you look at the brain regions in terms of connections, other species have similar connections to us. We just ended up using these pre-existing regions in much more sophisticated ways than other animals, which led to developing language really, really well, which then led to creative endeavors like this. So the first one that basically says humans are special because we learned how to cook, because your brain takes so much energy. It takes about 25% of your body's energy. Whatever you eat throughout the day, it takes 25% of energy from it. But it only weighs 1.5 kgs of your in your body weight. So it doesn't weigh much, but it needs a lot of energy. So in order to supply that kind of energy, using fire proved to be extremely helpful. What cooking did is essentially reduce the time we had to spend looking for food. If you look at some of the species of monkeys, what they do is they spend hours on end looking for fruits and roots that they can eat, and they spend 8 hours in a day just eating. So when you're thinking about eating and survival for 8 hours in a day, you clearly don't have time for stories. Discovering and controlling fire led us to pack extra calories in meat, which meant that we could just have a quick bite and then sustain ourselves for longer, which meant we had plenty of time at our hands. We made tools, we made progress. We started using language in interesting ways, which meant we had stories. So yes, that's a special thing about the human brain.
Why do we get dreams?
Nice question. Again, I'll go with the best reason that we have right now, which is memory consolidation. What researchers have shown is they took like a box in which a mouse was placed on one end and it had to walk through to the other end. And when it was walking, they recorded its brain activity while it was walking in real time. And then what they found is that when the mouse went to sleep, the same pattern of brain activity was repeating in its sleep. So again, we don't know if it was dreaming. We have no way of knowing that. But what we do know from that is the mice that replayed this activation in their sleep ended up remembering the maze better. So we know that when we are asleep, memories get consolidated. So maybe when we dream, it is our brain trying to replay some kind of information or trying to make sense of whatever information we have gotten in its own way, and we end up seeing it as a dream. That's the decent theory that we have, but again, we don't know for sure.
The question goes, do other animals have the power of abstract thinking?
Great question again. So I mentioned this one region that my supervisor and his colleagues could not find a match for in the monkey brain. And that region was this lateral frontal pole, which is like at the front in the middle of the brain. We know that in humans, that region is used to process abstract thinking and so on. And given that we did not find it in macaques, it's likely that they don't do abstract thinking. But we also don't have really clever tasks that we could give other animals in terms of abstract thinking. So we don't know, but it's unlikely.
So there's one really interesting question. Sir, have you watched Inception?
Inception. Was it Inception?
Yes, yes. Have you watched it, sir?
Yes, I have.
So there's one question regarding that movie, that is it possible, the theory of planting an idea in someone's mind, is it possible?
Short answer is yes. I don't know how to. But if you look at hypnosis and like suggestions that people usually do, there's something weird going on there for sure that we know of. Oh, but I'll tell you something even more cool. In my previous institute, there were some researchers. What they did was they asked participants to come into the lab. They put them in these MRI scanners, and they asked them to learn a few things. Okay, they asked them to learn some kind of diagram which was shown on screen, and with every diagram, they also sprayed a specific scent close to their nose. Okay, so let's say you have 20 different diagrams. With every diagram, you have a specific scent that is paired with that diagram. Okay. Now, later, what they did was they asked them to sleep in the lab. It was a sleep lab. And while they were asleep, they were monitoring their brain activity using EEG signals. While they were asleep, they sprayed only 10 of the 20 scent randomly while they were asleep. Now, ideally, if this link between smell and the diagram has successfully been established, when they get this scent, they should be able to activate also the brain region that is supposed to process this diagram images. Interestingly, after a few days, when they asked people which of the diagrams they had seen and which one they had not, they were able to remember those diagrams whose scent was sprayed when these people were asleep. So experimenters successfully were able to kind of strengthen the memory of certain diagrams based on this smell, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? If this is true, then if we listen to, let's say, you want to learn whatever other language, let's say you want to learn French, you go to sleep listening to some French sounds in your earphone or something, and then you fall asleep. Hopefully, when you wake up, you will remember some of them just because you're listening to it. But this is complete theory. I don't know what kind of research has been done about this. So yeah, I would say suggestion works. Does it work at the level of inception? I honestly don't know.
So we have a question from Dr. Priyanka Parmar, who's also our faculty in Department of Electronics. She's asking, since you talked about synthesia, is it a phenomenon which also occurs in children?
Yeah, so usually I would say like early teenage years is when you would obviously know, but usually these people say that they have always had it. So yeah, short answer is yes.
So final question from Dr.
Okay.
Amar Gambhir.
Uh-huh.
To what extent can artificial intelligence simulate the emotional aspects of a human being?
That's a loaded question, and it's a really hard question to answer as well. There were some really, really ambitious projects that were going on in which they were trying to map every single neuron in the human brain, every single connection, so that later they could replay whatever neuronal activity they would record from a person and then see if they could simulate human brain in a computer. Major roadblock there right now is just the amount of information we need to store and process to be able to deal with that kind of complexity. Right now, we have barely made it to mapping a mouse brain, which is tiny when compared to human brain. But I would say eventually, maybe, because if you believe that everything that happens to you as a person is coming from the brain, and if you simplify the brain to a bunch of firing neurons, if you can exactly copy those firing neurons in a computer, the result should also be the same. But again, this is highly debatable. Plenty of philosophers have debated about this for centuries now. Is it just the brain where you get your personality from? Is there something else? Is there a soul? Like, all kinds of discussions start when you start talking about simulating a brain. But what I can say is we have been fairly successful in looking at brain activity and guessing what a person is thinking of. So if I showed you two images and I recorded your brain activity when you saw image 1 and image 2, and later if I showed you one of these images and then some other random image, I will be able to say that you're thinking of this image that you've seen before. So some level of understanding, it's not really understanding, some level of decoding neuronal activation is happening, but we are nowhere near simulating emotional aspects of human brain. And yeah, honestly, it's still an open question. I just read one more question here. Do you mind if I answer it quickly, or?
No, sir.
Okay, I'll be really quick. So the question asked by Abhishek S is, people talk about IQs all the time, and I've read that for people with high IQs, the brain is more folded. Is there a limit to this? I mean, can we actually increase the intelligence of a person? This is a great question. A lot of students have asked me this before. The link between IQ and more folding is flimsy. We don't have enough evidence about it. The reason your brain is folded is because it needs to be packed in your skull. If your skull was bigger, it would not have been folded. So you need to pack all of these neurons inside the skull as if it's why there are folds. Just have evidence for that at all. Now, is there a limit to this? I guess yes, because the volume of the skull is fixed, and number of neurons a person has is also fairly fixed. So yeah, you can't force it down even more in a fixed volume of skull. And the last part of the question, can we actually increase the intelligence of a person? If you go by IQs, if you take IQ tests today, and let's say you get a certain number, which is your IQ today, I challenge you, you take the same or similar test and practice it for a few days. After a few days, if you take the IQ test again, even though all of the questions are different, your IQ points will be higher by anywhere between 5 to 6 points. So if your definition of intelligence is coming from this just one number, which is called IQ, then yes, increasing the intelligence of a person is extremely simple. Just train them on IQ tests. The only thing IQ tests can successfully measure is how well you can take tests and get results. Other than that, hardly anything, I think. So intelligence of a person, we don't know if it's directly dependent on more folds. When people say only 10% of the brain is used by normal people, Einstein was using 30%, false. We have no way of knowing. We don't even know what that means. We don't even know what the full capacity of the brain is. So estimating 10% is absolute nonsense. Don't believe it. And when it comes to thinking about intelligence, think about more about the mindset of a person. If you think you can do better by working hard, you're more likely to succeed rather than, oh, I cannot solve this problem, therefore I must be bad. If you get stuck in that pattern of thinking, which is called fixed mindset, it's likely that you will also feel like you're less intelligent. Instead, if you shift to growth mindset, which says that if I work hard enough, if I keep trying, I will get better. That's the growth mindset. You will more likely get better at doing everything, essentially. Yeah, sorry, I got distracted by this question because I saw it. But yeah, I'm done.
Yes, sir, it's fine. So do you wish to answer any other question from the chat box?
I haven't really had the time to go through it. I also don't know how much time we have. Are we constrained for time or not?
We are actually constrained, but you can go ahead.
No, I think we'll finish, Suhas. There is one question from Seema, I think. She says,
okay.
What is there in that Seema has gone? I just saw her once.
Why some people tell that early morning dreams come true?
No. What is
was that the question you were thinking of?
No. She has written something about people with autism. How is it different? Their brain? How do they work?
Okay. That's a great question again. We are still trying to understand what autism spectrum disorder is. What we do know is that they don't engage in like social interaction like other people do. They don't find it easy. They can become extremely fixated on certain things. Like if they're happy with music, for example, they can spend hours on end playing a certain instrument, learning music. They're usually good at math and so on. So in terms of brain changes, one good theory that we have is that so someone who is not diagnosed with autism, when they go through life, they look at a situation, they try to look at the context, and then they remember it for the next time, and then they apply it for the next time as well. What happens with people with autism is that they don't do this generalization. So every time they encounter a situation, it's almost like new for them. They have to figure out what the rules are every single time. So that's in terms of brain changes, that's one thing. Another thing is we know that they have difficulty communicating in normal speech, but since they like music so much, if you talk to them in like the sing-song language, like if you tell them, will you pick up this cup? They will respond to you better than if you just, shout at them and say, will you pick up this cup? So they do process information from the world slightly differently, but I guess if our world's rules are defined by non-autistic people, then of course people on the autism spectrum would find it difficult to deal with it. But yeah, we are still learning about this. There's plenty of good research out there. The thing is, the thing that we don't notice is that your brain is constantly trying to predict what is happening in the world. you're walking by, you don't even notice that your brain is processing, is there a step ahead? Should I move faster? Should I adjust my balance? If you're listening to a song, you're not really focusing on anything. You just know the meaning. So if I start a sentence, you would know how it would end. So your brain is constantly trying to predict what the next word will be and so on. Another theory says that there might be some difficulty in doing this task, the automated processing of incoming information and using it in a context for a later period is probably hampered. So yeah, that's the best answer I can give right now.
Thank you, sir. And as we reach the end of the session, I would like to remind the participants about the feedback form. Please do fill it to get your e-certificate. So now I would like to request Dr. Priyanka Parmar, Faculty of the Department of Electronics, St. Joseph's College Autonomous, to conclude the session.
Thank you, Aishwarya. A very good morning to our eminent speaker and all the participants joining from different parts of the globe. And a very good evening to everyone in India. On behalf of the convener of this webinar and the Department of Electronics, St. Joseph's College, Bangalore, we would like to express our heartfelt gratitude towards the speaker of today's webinar, Dr. Suhas Vijayakumar, for enlightening us with such an interesting topic. I'm sure not only me, but everyone here would have enjoyed listening to you on such an attention-holding session. And all the more you made understanding this topic so simple. The number of questions we received shows the enthusiasm the participants had in listening to you. A talk of surpassing excellence by Dr. Suhas today. I wish we could actually give you a round of applause, but since it's not possible, we probably can give a virtual round of applause to our speaker from wherever we are. Thank you, Dr. Suhas, for joining us all the way from Cambridge, USA, beating the distance and the time zones. We also wish to express, yeah, I can hear.
That's very kind of you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure and I absolutely enjoyed it. Yeah. I wish I could answer all of the questions. I'll try and figure out some way of doing it, either through blog posts or by making short videos on YouTube. So yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Thank you, sir. It was a brilliant talk. We wish to express our sincere thanks towards our respected rector, Father Suiber de Silva, for his priceless guidance and support. We are indeed grateful to our respected principal, Dr. Father Victor Lobo, for his encouragement, unstinting support, and guidance in conducting the webinar. We sincerely appreciate the untiring work put in by the convener of this webinar, Professor Regina Mathias. She is the person behind the successful conduction of this webinar, right from the inception of the idea to actually making it happen. Thank you, ma'am, for setting an example for all of us. I think you also deserve a big round of applause. Sincere thanks to all those.
Thank you so much, Priyanka.
A sincere thanks to all those who helped Ma'am Regina in organizing the webinar. Thanks to our dear student Aishwarya for welcome and moderating the session, especially the question answer session. We are grateful to the head faculty members and students of Department of Electronics, St. Joseph's College, for their support and encouragement. Last but not the least, we express our thanks to the audience for their listening ear and active participation. Thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant time.
Thank you, Priyanka.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, teachers. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, really.
Yes,
I had a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
Don't forget the feedback form to all the participants. And I think we are done with the talk and the session, so you can leave. Have a good day, everyone.
So thank you, Suhas. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, ma'am, for asking.